In today's world, educational credentials are not particularly granular. And the question is, does this match the needs of the employers in the future? This is one question we can ask. Our next speaker is somebody who's been involved in the use of technology and learning for over 30 years. And in addition to working for universities and corporations, he led innovation in the development and implementation of alternative digital credentials as the CEO of Deacon Digital. Please join me in welcoming Allyn Radford to the forum.
Hi there, and very pleased to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope that we can go on a very quick journey in the time that we have available, and we can explore some things that you will find useful. So I'm going to probably skate through this pretty quickly. And as I say, I hope that you'll get some takeaways out of this. We're going to look at the ideas of pathways, of employability, and how we can join these together and look at some aspects of navigation. What first then is employability? We're looking at this from different perspectives. So for a start, we have the notion. I'm having trouble with the keyboard here. Here we go. Traditional view, skills and capabilities that allow you to be employed. I won't fight with the dictionary definition, but perhaps we need to extend this a little bit as we move forward. We're starting to see a dimension evolve, which looks at not just employability as a fixed thing in time, but that it has a future dimension to it, and that people need to consider employability as something that is not earned once and then present. If you're looking at how you maintain your employment and how you obtain future employment, obviously there needs to be a change in your employability as you move forward. This is exacerbated by what happens with the fourth industrial revolution. We find that work in all sorts of different contexts is being impacted, and governments talk about future of work, and they should. But as an individual, what I'm concerned about is the future of employability, and how I continually reassert that while my job changes, I am still fit for that job. And that's another dimension that we have not been looking at, or have not needed to look at in quite the same way in the past. The World Economic Forum has released a series of reports, and they have very much emphasized the fact that there is a compelling business case for people to be reskilling at-risk workers, that they need to look at how they upskill the broader workforce. But most importantly, how do you build the structures to become a learning organization? And all of these things mesh together in that whole idea of employability and pathways, and how people stay relevant into the future. So there are different pathways that we can take. And on the one hand, we're reasonably clear and have a concept of career development over time. We're less used to the idea of continually asserting that we are employable, even if we stay in the same position. But that is a necessary dimension. So what we find is that over time, we need to keep our eye on both of these particular tracks as we navigate our future, and that employability is very much a journey, as many of the other things are that we're looking at in this new context. Pathways are something that within a particular industry context we are familiar with. If we look at this in an ICT context, we're familiar with seeing pathways that in many ways are linear. You go from beginner up to expert over a period of time. You largely stay within your swim lane. You may change to an adjacent swim lane, but it's not broadly past that. So if we think about this, as we move towards a world in which we have hybridized skills, this is less relevant to us. The other fact, and it was very nicely done by the government of Alberta, that they provided the students with this guidance, really, that says don't necessarily think that you're going to go on one single linear pathway. You are going to navigate as best you can through a whole range of these different experiences, and all of these squiggly lines are going to better describe what you do. The trouble is there isn't a really good way of navigating through these really squiggly lines. Some work that we've been doing here in Australia, or that the NCEVA has been doing here in Australia, is looking at this model where we move from qualifications to pathways. The value is moving towards pathways from qualifications. There's a longitudinal study that they do with students over a 10-year period. And when they looked at the employment of people going through different pathways when they achieved the age of 25, people who went through alternative pathways early into work, dipping into different educational experiences and achieving different kinds of credentials, if you like, or qualifications, 84.8% of them were employed at the age of 25. Whereas when you look at a traditional pathway going from school to higher education to work, only 64% were employed at the age of 25. This brings into question the idea of navigation in this particular view. We need people making these choices to be better informed. We don't want them to waste their money and their time doing things that are not really going to help them achieve where they want to go. And we need to think beyond just the traditional pathways and traditional ways of doing things. There is a new report that's just been released that really confirms much of this. So pathways tend to need navigation. If we think about navigation in traditional terms, and we think about mapping, etc., if I wanted to travel from Vancouver to Toronto, I've got a number of options that I can take. Even if I'm driving, there's all sorts of different choices that I can make along the way. Or I could fly and I could be there sooner. But the flying experience takes away from the on-the-ground experience. Let's face it, if I'm going from Vancouver, according to this map, one of the first things I do is cross over into the United States, so I'd have to learn how to speak American. And for an Australian, that might be a particular challenge. We also get other information from these from this navigation, which helps us to make good decisions that I'll have to account for the fact that there'll be a ferry, that there's going to be tolls on the route, and because of this current era in which we live, that there may be border restrictions related to the pandemic. So this rich set of data becomes useful to me because of a number of other points that I can correlate. If we take this into a career perspective, what we find is that we have some analogs. So the first question we need to find out is, what's the domain I'm talking about? Where could I be in this world? If I'm looking at a map of Canada compared to a map of Australia, they look very different. So where could I be? This is the map data. And when we're looking at this from a career perspective, we're talking about the frameworks and the career data that can be used to situate somebody. But how do we locate them? With maps, of course, we've got GPS data, and here on the educational and career side, turning towards employability, what we're looking at is credentials and skills data. Ultimately, the destination is a physical destination or it is a job. Fortunately, if we take this and we put it into action, we have many of the tools that we need are available right now. So we have methods of managing frameworks and comparing them and relating them to each other. We have ways of observing the verifications and validations that have taken place. So we have credential platforms that we can use to describe these things. And of course, Tribe ID has a whole range of these sorts of descriptors available and can do this on the blockchain for you. Ultimately, what we need is capability-based descriptions that can help us to navigate through these particular pathways. So it's a very high-level view, but we can dig down a little bit further. Not right now, but I think you'll find an opportunity to do that. Maps have to go beyond disciplines, and particularly pathways, need to navigate through disciplines as we look at what happens with a continuing focus on employability. So rather than having very linear views of things, we need something that's a bit more like the London Tube map. It's not just about the red line. It's about where you go from the red line to the orange line, to the purple line, to the green line, because that will take you in the direction you need to go. This, in essence, is starting to make some sense out of those squiggles, that you can see how they fit as you're going on the journey rather than after the fact. So the frameworks act as map data, and they come from industries, vendors, employers. There's a lot of them in IT because of its nature, but we also have qualification frameworks. All of these things need to be able to be blended together, and we need to understand relative values. We have to move away from the idea that pathways assume that you're going through a progression in one field of interest, and we need to provide new data so that people can migrate into hybridized jobs and to change their directions when they need to. There's been a significant lack in the areas when we look at the employability skills, and some of that is maturing now. There is a framework that was released this year, which is the third generation framework by Marcus Bowles, and he uses these discipline domains, uses these domains to think about different ways of describing what people are able to do within an employability context. There are different views of how you can use this, and that's some of the work that we're doing right now in terms of applying this into employability contexts. What we found in the work that we did during the time at Deakin Digital was that there were really three categories of things we need to be focused on. There are the transferable skills, or these employability skills we've been talking about, and they are really in the form of capabilities. There are technical and functional skills, which are really mostly in the form of competencies. And then, of course, there are the leadership skills, which again are generally capabilities. We distinguish between competencies and capabilities. They are not the same thing. And what we need to do is ensure that in each of these categories we have anchor points and levels so that we can align these things through an employability journey. Which brings us to the way we describe them, which is credentials. And credentials, I distinguish between micro-credentials, which is where you're looking at assessed learning. And then the other view of this is really looking at the alternative digital credentials, which is the work that we participated in with the ICDE. And this focuses on competency and capability. The biggest distinction between these is that micro-credentials are really applying a credential to learning what you have learned, and alternative credentials are really about what you can do. And they don't really care about where or how you learn something. They care that you can be measured against a particular standard, or if you like, that your claim that you can do these things can be verified. So if we put this into practice right now, and we look at what happens in a very well-known enterprise view, the desired competencies, knowledge, and behavior becomes expressed as frameworks. The individual's focus on these things becomes assessed and becomes credentials. And those credentials are really the glue that holds the organizational needs and the individual's desires together. And that becomes extremely empowering. It enables aspirational development of the workforce and supports employee engagement. So we see employability from a very different perspective when we take this particular view. I'll leave this pathway, you'll probably have access to it, and it just looks at a kind of a pathway from somebody going from year 10 through into work and the different kinds of opportunities that they may have to assert their employability even from an early age, and move into alternative pathways which say that you might get early into career engagement. So some of the key principles for continuous employability: it's holistic, it's not point source. You need to be able to make sure that people can make their choices and find their best fit. You must support the flow in and out of particular disciplines or areas of engagement in the workforce. That's critical for hybridization of work that needs to take place. It needs to be supporting incremental approaches, because that's what you need for lifelong learning. Traditional qualifications are episodic, and they actually create a barrier towards lifelong learning, whereas more granular credentials open that up to you. There must be the accountability of capability and competence that becomes the way of describing these credentials, and they must be authentic when it comes to looking at capability and competence. Of course, it does need to be integrated within an ecosystem and the subsystems that are actually responsive to the needs. So experiential work integrated learning becomes really important, that there needs to be the granular learning followed by implementation, and that employers become key stakeholders in this view. And we need to observe that very clearly. So in that really fast zipping through what we're looking at in terms of this employability model, we haven't dug down into the frameworks and the value models. We haven't looked at these relationships between abilities, capabilities, and competence. We haven't really looked at the professional practice view of earning credentials. And we haven't looked at the architectures that sit underneath these things. These are all in-depth explorations, but at least we can give you a view to where you may wish to go when you're looking at these particular areas. So I hope that hasn't been too quick, and that we've been able to cover off some areas of value. Jay, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. That was terrific. And as with a lot of these talks today, in fact, all of them, my mind continues to be expanded and filled with new knowledge. You know, one question, this framework of micro-credentials, alternative credentials, it all seems to be quite fully realized. It's thorough, you know, and I'm hearing about it, you know, I'm a novice, but it sounds quite comprehensive and thorough. But it seems like we have a chicken and an egg problem. Do the educational institutions or the vocational schools start doing it and hope that employers say, yeah, we accept it? Or do employers need to say, hey, this is what we need, can you provide it? Or do policymakers have to get involved? Like, what's it gonna take to get this from 0 to 30 miles an hour?
Yeah, so really important question. Back in 2014, when I first started getting involved in credentialing, which is fairly near the early days of this, at Deakin Digital, the one mantra that I kept in focus was employers are the arbiters of our success. If the employers accept these credentials, and you need to build the trust around that to be able to do that, then the rest of it becomes a fait accompli, because people will want to assert themselves against the things that employers value. That's how you get a job.
Okay. Yeah, it's I guess it could be frustrating if you have the educational perspective when there's a solution or a tool that can make the system more effective, more productive, more valuable for all the stakeholders. But if there's a kind of a hurdle in the road, that's tough. So something we'll have to think about. Thank you so much for that. That was
my pleasure. Thank you.